Okay, so this is our last session. My name is Sebastian Edwards, and I want to thank the organizers for including me in this great tribute to John Taylor. We have a great panel. I will follow the other sessions and say a few words before asking our speakers to start their conversation. So I always thought that public service, we're going to talk about John in government in this session, and I always thought that public service was sort of the culmination of someone's career. And what we see with John Taylor is that he's been out and in to public service from very early on. Senior economist at the council, a member of the council, several advisory boards, undersecretary of the Treasury. So his has been, I think, in many ways, an exemplary pattern and path for young economists. I'm not sure when I met John Taylor. I know that as soon as I met him, many of the adjectives that were used earlier, like kindness, immediately came to my mind. But we served together in, I don't know if he remembers, he's in there now, in the Arnold Schwarzenegger's Council for Economic Advisors. And the one thing that impressed me about that situation, you have to remember that George Shultz chaired the council, and Milton was a member of the council, and Eddie Lazier, and John Taylor, and Mike Boskin. I mean, it was amazing for me coming from LA once every 5 or 6 weeks. And then, of course, Arnold, who was an incredible figure. And the one thing that was quite impressive about, to me, about John at that time is that he was very modest. He already was very famous. The Taylor rule was around and was dominant, but John was very, very modest. I'm talking, John, when you and I were members of the council for Schwarzenegger, and that was an amazing story. Barry Eichengreen brought up the book. I think that if we want to understand John Taylor in government, reading, if you haven't read it, or reread it. I reread parts of it in the last few days. Global Financial Warriors. It has in the first chapter a whole discussion about John spending time in the Situation Room at the White House. And I imagine that Condi, of course, was there. And she may be talking about that in her presentation. But the part I like the most is when John Taylor goes on a C-130 from Kuwait to Baghdad the first time. And he's dressed just like he's now. He tells the story. Dark blue suit, a necktie, and black street shoes. And everyone else on the plane is, of course, wearing combat boots and camouflage dresses and so on. And you go and read through the book, and it's an amazing story. And you can see John in government around the world. I originally, I come from Latin America, as some of you know. And the story I like about John, and Krueger was also involved in this the most, is the role he had in the Argentine crisis of 2001. And John said, well, there's going to be contagion, and the number one contagion from Argentina is Uruguay. And these guys are more or less well-behaved. They don't have to fall because Argentina is falling. And John played a very, very important role. And Uruguayans, every time I talk to people in Uruguay, they always remember John very fondly because of the work he did there. I personally have benefited a lot from John's work, teaching macroeconomics to MBA students. The Taylor rule is a winner. They understand it, they like it, but one has to teach them a few things. One of them is what John Cochran said earlier, which is, I think, very important. It's not a mechanical rule. You cannot just feed it into a computer and have a computer run monetary policy. It gives you some elements, and then the policymaker has to decide what to do. Every year, I offer a prize to my students if they find a country where there hasn't been massive work on the Taylor rule, and they haven't ever found it. So I am increasing the amount of money that I give away. And so you look, India, Taylor rule, there's 1 million papers, literally. Google tells you how many entries there are. The other benefit that I've had from John's work is that I go around Latin America advising governments, and when central bankers don't want to listen to what I'm saying, I drop his name. And I say, my friend John Taylor, and they say, oh, you know John Taylor? And the attitude absolutely, completely changes. It's different to say that you know and you're a friend of John Taylor than to, there are some people that say, does he really exist? It happened to me in Guatemala, of all places, right? Let me just mention a couple of things before asking the members of the panel, which, as following the earlier sessions, I'm not going to introduce because everyone knows everyone here. John played a very important role in convincing emerging markets that capital controls were a bad idea. And I think that that was a battle that largely he won. And we're seeing now Argentina lifting capital controls, and we'll see where that goes. It's a big question mark, and I am personally optimistic. Another issue that has to do with John's work in government, and where he convinced me, is whether the exchange rate should be in the Taylor rule. Originally, I thought that it should. We had a lot of conversations, and John convinced me that if you have a proper model of inflation, the exchange rate is already there. You don't have to add it as a third term. Let me just finish by saying three things, or picking up on three things that were discussed in the earlier sessions that I think are important. One of them I already mentioned, that the Taylor rule is not a mechanical device, that it should provide some information on the conversation that central bankers have. The second one is the Taylor principle. Phi, I think that's how John, phi greater than 1. It's almost impossible, in my experience, to convince a central banker that phi should be greater than 1. And someone said in the last session, I think, that it's cumulative greater than 1, that you go step by step, step by step. But when you tell them, and it's happened to me in every country in Latin America, and some in Africa and in Asia, you tell them you have to increase interest rates, raise interest rates by more than the increase in expected inflation. They say, no way, we ain't gonna do it. So I think that there is something there that has to do with persuasion and how you present that. And the final point is something that Robert Barrow brought up earlier, which is emergencies, and when you put the Taylor rule, or rules in general, on hold while the emergency takes place. And I think that we need further discussion on those issues. I've done some work on the what happened in 1933 with the abandonment of the gold standard and the abrogation of the gold clause. So that was a great emergency, but I think that we need more work there. So let me then thank John for all his work and add my voice to the celebration, and then introduce the panel, and we're going to have Condoleezza first. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being here for this wonderful celebration of John Taylor's tremendous contributions to the Academy, of course, but I want to talk a little bit about his contribution to government, where I was really had a chance to serve twice with John. Now, a lot of you know the story from the second time that I served with John. We were post 9/11, and we were trying to figure out how we were going to trace terrorist financing. And it turns out you needed economists to do that. And so John was very much a part of the team that put together a resolution in the Security Council just a couple of weeks after 9/11 that allowed us to trace terrorist financing. John also, as Sebastian just mentioned, had the good fortune to be the person who changed out the Saddam dinar for a new currency for Iraq. And I do remember sitting in the Situation Room when John described to the president and all assembled exactly what this was going to entail. And if you're in the government and somebody tells you that this entails taking a huge transport plane with literally millions of dinars on them to a place that was not so stable and changing out the currency essentially by hand, I could see the kind of white-sheeted look on the face of the president, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, kind of what are we doing here? But John pulled it off. Now, those are stories that are perhaps relatively well known about his impact on terrorist financing after 9/11 and replacing the Saddam currency. But the first time that I encountered John in government was actually in 1989. What the Saddam and 9/11 stories tell you is that you go into government expecting one thing and you end up doing quite another. And so in 2001, we would have gone in expecting a kind of normal set of policy problems. And of course, we had 9/11 and we had the Iraq War. But this was also true the first time that I encountered John in 1989. Now, I had known John and Mike Boskin because they were Stanford colleagues. And I was the young Soviet specialist on the NSC staff for Brent Scowcroft. And here was our problem. All of a sudden, all of these countries wanted to leave the Soviet bloc and become our allies and our friends. The Soviet system was collapsing before our very eyes. And the first pin that was pulled in the Soviet system was when Poland decided that it was going to move from a communist government to its first elected democratic government. This was, as you can imagine, an extraordinary moment for those of us who had been raised on the Cold War, who understood that Poland was in fact where the Cold War began. But the problem was that the president had made this no new taxes pledge, and we were, shall I say, resource constrained. And so when the president called his secretaries together to ask, what shall we do in August of 1989 when the new finance minister of Poland, Balcerowicz, was coming to Washington, let's just say that the suggestions from the secretaries were underwhelming. The one that I remember most was that the Commerce Department thought that we should send a trade mission to Poland. Now, this didn't seem to meet the moment of Poland moving from communism to capitalism. And so we kept getting these really bad ideas from various government officials and various secretaries. But I got an idea from somebody named Jeff Sachs, actually at Harvard, which was something called a standby loan for Poland, so that Poland could exchange the zloty, and it would be backed so that the currency wouldn't collapse when the exchange took place. The problem was the Treasury hated this idea. And it was very clear that it wasn't going to get done on the advice of a junior staffer in the NSC. And so I thought, maybe I'll go and visit my buddies Boskin and Taylor and see what they think. And they wrote the paper that then allowed George H.W. Bush to do a standby loan for Poland in the IMF. The zloty was exchanged. We had behind it, backing it, $1 billion loan that was never touched. That was the work of Mike Boskin and John Taylor through the CEA. And that story says something very special about what you have to do when you come to government. You come as an academic, and so you come with deep expertise. And that's why you're valued. But you also have to be practical. You simply can't tell the Poles that they've just thrown off 45 years of communism and they're going to have a trade mission from the United States of America. So you do have to be practical. You also have to be creative and adaptive. And John and Mike, in that moment, were creative and adaptive. You have to be a leader. You have to be willing to take a risk, because for the president's CEA to step in where the Treasury dared not tread, I think was something of, shall we say, a career-risking opportunity. And most importantly, you had to be trusted. And John Taylor was in all of those examples, whether taking the dinar to Iraq, creating the terrorist financing resolution in the Security Council, or deciding that yes, we could do more for Poland. John was trusted by the president, by his colleagues, by foreign governments, and by our allies. That really, I think, in many ways sums up what it was like to work with John Taylor in government. He was expert, practical, creative, and adaptive, but more than anything, he was someone that you could trust to come up with the right solution at the right time. John, I loved working with you in government. I'm glad we'll never have to do it again.
Our next speaker is John Lipsky.
Indeed. Well, one of the risks of coming late in a program is that you'll find that everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. But of course, it's an honor and a great personal pleasure to have been invited to participate in this wonderful event in honor of John Taylor, my former Stanford classmate, housemate, and close friend of 56 years standing. I'll begin by noting, like others, I prepared for this by rereading John's 2007 book, The Global Financial Warriors. It's a terrific summary of his service as Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs during 2001 to 2005, which was hugely challenging. When you read the introduction, you note that John notes that policymaking involves first developing policy ideas and then implementing them, and that these are very different challenges requiring different skills and different methods. Well, I immediately thought back to our time as classmates in the graduate economics program here at Stanford. The program was quite small for such a renowned department. I think that at that time there were only about 35 students in each year. So everyone got to know everybody else very well. There was no doubt among us that John was going to make a mark in the profession. John's grasp of theory was impressive, matched only by his interest in mastery of technique. His first thesis topic had to be abandoned when it became clear that he was being beaten to the punch by Ed Prescott's research at Carnegie Mellon, work, by the way, that formed the basis for Prescott eventually being awarded a Nobel Prize. But John alters his theme and still was one of the first of us to finish. And that work, in turn, formed the basis of one of John's most cited scholarly articles. If John had any early issues in his career, it seemed to me that his econometrician colleagues found his theoretical contributions to be so important that he must be viewed as a theorist. Conversely, his colleagues working on macro and monetary theory found his econometric work to be so impressive that he must be viewed as an econometrician. That he also became famous for the effectiveness and popularity of his introductory economics courses suggests another quality. That is, it takes superior intelligence to be able to make complex and difficult topics clear and understandable. In addition, as we've heard already today, John mentored many notable doctoral students. My point's straightforward. Even from his student days, John was fascinated by basic principles, but also about how to make them applicable. That this tendency helped to give birth to the world-famous and widely applied Taylor rule for conducting monetary policy should have been no surprise. Now, please allow me one humble brag side note here. Despite John's tremendous contributions, he always remained personally modest. It was my Solomon Brothers colleagues and I who lay claim to having named John's policy rule, originally contained in an obscure scholarly paper, as Valerie showed us earlier, we named it the Taylor rule. And as Casey Stengel once said, you can look it up. In Global Financial Warriors, John notes that one of the lessons of effective leadership is to establish a clear set of principles or goals or objectives or rules and to stick with them as each decision is made. This was so clear in his own actions that at the ceremony marking the end of his service as the Undersecretary of the Treasury, his staff presented him with a plaque listing 10 additional so-called Taylor rules. Now, I imagine it's known in this audience, actually it's been mentioned by Barry Eichengreen, I was Ann Krueger's successor as the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. And since my term ran from September 2006 through August 2011, I didn't actually serve at the same time in Washington as John, unlike Ann. However, some of the most challenging situations I faced reflected issues that John also had faced and rules that he had helped to formulate. First, if you will, a few quick remarks about the role of the International Monetary Fund. Popular myth would have it that the IMF initially was created simply to operate a system of fixed exchange rates. And when this system collapsed in 1972, it pivoted to making loans to member countries in order to resolve economic and financial crises. However, it's instructive to peruse the fund's constitutional articles of agreement. In enumerating the purposes of the fund, the articles begin by charging the institution first with, quote, facilitating the expansion and balanced growth of international trade, to promote exchange stability, to assist in the establishment of a multilateral system of payments in respect of current transactions between members, and in the elimination of foreign exchange restrictions, and only lastly, to give confidence to members by making the general resources of the fund temporarily available to them under adequate safeguards. As for the fund's original dollar exchange system, in which currencies were pegged to the dollar and the dollar was pegged to gold, this always was a system of fixed but flexible rates, as the system contemplated possible adjustments of currency's dollar pegs. Moreover, according to an important but not widely known 2004 article by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart, this system in practice was much more flexible than is commonly recognized. Similarly, the post-1972 so-called flexible rate system today includes 66 currencies that are classified as pegged, plus another 82 classified as managed, but only 66 currencies that are freely floating. In other words, the impact from the move from fixed to flexible exchange rates in 1972 was far less definitive than is thought commonly. Instead, the most radical initial change associated with the creation of the IMF was the promise by members to eliminate payments and restrictions on current transactions. At the time the articles were agreed, virtually every member had such restrictions, and their progressive elimination, exactly as contemplated by the articles, was the key driver of the rapid growth of international trade during 1950 to 2007. And parenthetically, this probably was the strongest period of sustained global economic growth ever achieved. However, it was another development, and one that by and large existed outside the fund's formal purview, that represented the most pervasive change in the international financial system, forming one of John Taylor's important challenges during his time in office. That was the opening of international capital markets and the ongoing growth in trade and securities, mainly equities and bonds, as well as hedging instruments, rather than traditional bank lending. Remember, the articles don't give the fund any direct jurisdiction over capital account transactions. In any case, such transactions hardly existed in the fund's early days, and some of the system's architects, like Keynes, didn't think they should be permitted at all. While international bank lending to sovereign borrowers only became important during the 1970s, the growth of the euro bond market began at about the same time, and by now, securitized capital flows, as Mike Boskin mentioned, have far eclipsed cross-border bank lending. Moreover, international payments crises involving bank loans were rather orderly and slow-moving affairs. As a fund staff member in the early 1980s, I can recall the resolution process involving the leading bankers of the world being summoned to a meeting at IMF headquarters, being told by the fund's then managing director, Jacques de Larosière, by the way, with Fed Chair Paul Volcker looking on approvingly, exactly how much they were expected to contribute to the resolution of the payments crisis in country X under terms effectively dictated by the fund. However, when the issue is a potential default on sovereign bonds, the challenge is of a different nature, both in terms of speed and complexity. Clearly, a new debt resolution system was required. Hence, the effective competition in the early aughts between two prospective alternative approaches to dealing with the payments crisis, involving the rapidly growing stock of sovereign debt denominated in a currency other than by the issuers. That Barry Eichengreen talked about was the IMF's proposed sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, an approach that would have granted unprecedented bankruptcy court-like powers over sovereign borrowers to the IMF versus the much more market-oriented collective action clause approach favored by both financial market participants and the US Treasury. John and Ann Krueger know every detail of this debate that was resolved in favor of the so-called CACs, and maybe Ann will be talking about that later. Eventually, more open capital markets meant the possible emergence of unprecedented payments imbalances, and eventually more sizable calls on fund resources to help to resolve crises. Resolution of payments crises always involves striking a balance between finance, in other words, the granting of new credits by lenders, and adjustment, a euphemism for belt-tightening by the borrower. Some folks, including George Shultz, as well as John, worried about the risk of the IMF becoming too willing to provide finance instead of insisting on lasting adjustment in the resolution of crises. Hence the effort, spurred by John and the US Treasury, to encourage the IMF to develop what was called an exceptional access procedure, as Barry talked about earlier. Under this procedure, rules were developed that in effect would limit the prospect of the IMF providing very large financing arrangements, probably viewed by many as excessive as well as exceptional, to a country in debt distress. The details of the procedure that was adopted can be debated, but the goal was justifiable. However, when the global financial crisis hit, after John had returned to Stanford and I had just arrived at the fund, the Greek debt crisis exploded, as it had become clear that the country had been running unsustainable fiscal deficits, the huge magnitude of which had been hidden in official statistics. At the same time, Greece had managed to become a member of the euro, the European common currency, while effectively remaining outside the single market, thus preserving and protecting domestic inefficiencies while progressively reducing the economy's competitiveness, even while being able temporarily to sell sovereign debt on exceptionally favorable terms. At first, the European Commission and Greece sought to resolve the crisis without involving the IMF, but the situation only became worse. Eventually, the situation neared total collapse, and the fund finally was called in. The Greeks insisted that they wouldn't accept any solution that involved their being expelled from the euro. The European Commission, for its part, insisted they would not accept any solution that required debt restructuring, and they were willing to augment the IMF's resources in the amount needed to make a deal. In the end, they provided 2/3 of the required funding. However, it became clear that an IMF program adequate to halt the crisis while preserving these two red lines was going to fail to meet all the requirements of the existing exceptional access procedure. However, Greece's membership in the European Union and its participation in the euro differentiated it from previous cases, although it was followed by crises in Ireland and Portugal, but those are stories for another day. Greece, by definition, didn't have either independent monetary or exchange rate policies to utilize to adjust. At the same time, the European Commission feared that the failure to agree to an IMF stabilization program could lead to a systemic crisis that could threaten European stability. In the event, a modification to the exceptional access procedure was accepted, a so-called systemic exception, and the deal was approved. Unfortunately, while the fund viewed efficiently boosting systemic reforms agreed by the Greek authorities to be the heart of the program, the Greek authorities simply didn't implement them and the program failed. The next step was inevitable. The European Commission accepted the need for debt restructuring, but by then the risk of a systemic crisis had passed. Sadly, it took long years for a Greek government to be willing to make the needed structural reforms that point toward a much brighter future, but happily that's the case today. Well, there's another twist to the story that involves John. The fund's Articles of Agreement mandate a review of the voting power of member countries at least every 5 years, in the interest of ensuring that voting power reflects member countries' economic weight. Suffice it to say that since any realignment of voting shares and associated executive board chairs is a zero-sum negotiation, it took a huge effort to reach an agreement on an interim alteration at the Seoul G20 Leaders Summit in November 2010 that reduced the voting share of mainly of European members while rewarding dynamic emerging and developing countries. The plan was that the Seoul Agreement was to be ratified in time for the IMF annual meetings in October 2012, and that another set of adjustments would be negotiated in a follow-up round to be concluded in 2015. In the United States, such an agreement requires congressional approval. For whatever reason, the Obama administration simply did not include the required language to approve the Seoul deal in their 2011 budget. And as Republicans took the majority in the House in the subsequent midterm elections, it became necessary to get their support for ratification. For some time, it appeared that US approval might never be forthcoming, which would have been a tremendous blow to international cooperation. The reasons for the stalemate can be discussed, but to suffice to say that the responsibility was shared widely. However, John, who, as we know, strongly supports the idea of a rules-based international system, played a critical role in negotiating the solution that was finally reached in December 2015. The fund agreed to restore the previous exceptional access procedure, dropping the systemic exception, and Congress agreed to approve the Seoul Agreement on chairs and shares, as it's known. John proved once again to be someone, perhaps the only one, who was trusted on all sides to play it straight and whose judgment was respected by all. Fast forward to today. The follow-up voting share adjustment that had been promised for 2015 has yet to occur, and no one is holding their breath anticipating a quick resolution under the current circumstances. Moreover, I presume that everyone here has a view about the United States' current international and economic and financial policies. That wise leadership is needed goes without saying. At present, John's former position of Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs is vacant, and to date, no one has been nominated to the post. Let us hope that someone with John's wisdom, judgment, experience, and clarity of vision, not to mention energy and determination, is found to take up the critical work that goes with this position. What we know for sure is that we were all lucky that John was on the job when we were faced with a series of unprecedented challenges. And you can look it up in John's book, Global Financial Warriors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Now we have Ann Krueger.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be asked to be here and to share in celebrating John and so many contributions he's made. John and I were colleagues at Stanford. He came here well before I did, but we overlapped here quite a few years. John then went to Washington, and I think I followed, at his invitation about 4 months later to the IMF, so that we then overlapped there until he left, and I stayed on just a little while afterward. But we had a lot of contact during that time. And I want to take a minute and just tell you a little bit about the things the Undersecretary in the Treasury for International Affairs does, because it's to my mind, I just don't understand how anybody can keep on top of that job, and because it controls so much. It basically is in charge of every economic activity in the U.S. and abroad in which the U.S. government has an interest. John's vast responsibilities included U.S. policies and economic interactions with individual countries, with international organizations, both regional and national, and almost anything else that came up with regard to other countries that had an economic dimension, which is to say almost anything in the whole world. Oh, thank you. Other divisions of the Treasury cover domestic policy and operations, including U.S. government debt and anti-money laundering. But indeed, when the International Finance Division, which John had to face those issues, of course, it was the anti-money laundering international part that became most important. And I think that they worked very well together, thanks much to John in that regard. But there were many other things. Coordinating economic activities with the G7, which in itself is a challenge, and the G20, which is another challenge, and groups of countries such as the Asian Development Bank, and I could go on and on and on, but I won't, and determining U.S. policy on the dollar exchange rate and U.S. lending to countries in economic difficulty. I won't say more on the exchange rate, partially because others have, but partially because John was instrumental in getting, I think the first time, the Treasury did not involve even once during his tenure in the exchange rate market, which was quite an achievement in itself and something for which everyone in this country and everyone in the world should probably be thankful. It was a major accomplishment, and I would love to say 5 or 10 minutes on it, John, but I can't, so I'll go on and just say, don't forget the exchange rate. It was very important. Lots of other things, including, of course, representation and purview over the IMF and the World Bank, in which case we had a fair amount of contact together. I'm not going to cover them all because I would get kicked out of here by the chair if nothing else, but I will focus on several of his important achievements but ignore some of the other major issues in which he dealt. I was going to talk a bit about the Iraq initial reconstruction, in which the IMF played a part, and John and I worked together to some extent. But on the other hand, I'll skip it briefly, except to say that Condi talked about taking the money over there. The problem was getting the money in the first place, and that was a big part of it, and we worked a bit on that as well as other things. Obviously, anti-terrorism financing policy, and I will say more on that. The Argentine crisis, in which both of us were involved very much. So, and I was going to say sovereign debt, I'll say something about, but I will skip the exchange rate policy for lack of time. Lots of issues in those cases, and I'm going to just hit the highlights. Turning to the Iraqi situation, planning for reconstruction after a possible war in Iraq. If you stop and think about it, when the war is still going on, you don't know how it's going to come out. You don't know what the situation was before the war because economic policy was so messed up. The statistics are not available, and yet you are going to plan what happens and how you operate as soon as the war ends. I think if anybody put that on a PhD written exam, there's a question as to what the answer would be. My guess is it'd be a blank piece of paper. They wouldn't know where to begin. But of course, that was one of the challenges John was confronted with. And of course, it was an important one and had lots to do with it. I had a little small part in that, of actually asking John's help. Because 9/11 happened, I think, about 4 days after I had just come as first deputy managing director of the fund. And I got there, and within 2 days of my getting there, the managing director went off to Europe, and I was acting managing director. And along came 9/11. And I think you were out of the country too at the time, John, if I'm right. But in any event, what happened was, the problem was that the managing director couldn't get back from Europe because there were no planes. And I called John, and so pretty soon we had the managing director on another of those cargo transports. As the managing director came back, and I heard all about the discomforts of those transports for about a week afterward. So in any event, it was one of our initial contacts, so I'd only been there about 4 days at the time. But in any event, the currency problems, the getting the banking going, even the problem of finding the Iraqis who you could get to do some of the jobs in the civil service, finding buildings they could operate because so many buildings were destroyed, and so it was itself a great challenge. Now, I'm again going to go on and skip some of what I had to say here for lack of time. Because of the things John did, the one that at the moment is having the most immediate lasting impact, not necessarily the longest, but the most immediate, is of course what he did in the financing of the anti-terrorism drive. Until John came to the Treasury, or in fact even after he came until 9/11, what had happened was that when countries didn't want to go to war with other countries, but they wanted to do something, trade sanctions were very frequently what was done. We will no longer export to you such and such, or we will no longer import from you such and such. And trade sanctions have a long history. They are interesting, mostly because they're largely ineffective. And I mean very ineffective. They're ineffective for reasons I could go into. I could entertain you for hours with stories of how sanctions get evaded one way or another. I'll just tell you one, which is when the Sinai Peninsula went over from Israel to Egypt. What happened was that an Israeli soldier one night was driving from back along the Sinai coming toward Israel and saw some lumps in the sand. Those lumps in the sand turned out to be cars made in Israel But the next day they would be in Egypt because, of course, the country was going to change hands. So those cars were smuggled into Egypt, which had much higher car prices than Israel, and yet it never entered into the records. And one of the problems is you never know who and how is going to find other ways of doing things like that throughout the world, and the number of stories about inventive ways of smuggling and of evading sanctions. The easy ones are third countries, but at the moment we have ghost ships that are bringing Soviet or Russian oil everywhere, and many other things that are not just the things of one person's imagination. They're huge, they're big business, and they're not there. So the immediate question John faced was that we have all these terrorists, what have you, they don't work within borders. And somehow or other they're getting financed. And obviously, they need that money or they can't do that, what they want to do. So you've got to try and cut off the money. How do you do that? And getting monetary sanctions going and getting involved in getting other countries involved with the US so it wasn't just moving from dollars to pounds or to euros was, of course, a major challenge. Many of us were not only willing, able to go along, more than that, but on the other hand, a little bit doubtful that we could really impose them. In fact, the allies in this case, could effectively impose them enough. John managed to get the cooperation of a significant, I think a very large fraction of the world's money supply cooperating with us in terms of the anti-sanctions move. He managed also to get organizations like the International Transfer Clearing Mechanism, SWIFT, involved, and so on and so forth, the result of which was that for the first time there was an effective sanctions mechanism. Now, the trouble with that is, of course, that once you've done it, you can't do it again if it's already there. And there are problems that way, and people, even with financial sanctions, do learn. And it's almost the economic equivalent of a military nuclear weapon, in the sense that you can really punish a country. And my question, my suggestion about that right now would be, look at the Iranians, who have been so badly damaged despite their oil and selling it through China to Russia and so on, that they are now looking for change because they've basically been forced to their knees, and it's been the power of financial sanctions, if you want only one case. Not that they were perfectly effective, but they've been effective enough to bring about important changes. I am not an enthusiast because I fear the long-term consequences, but on the other hand, I do recognize that this was a major contribution and that there are times when you need to use it. I have to turn to Argentina. We both faced that. And it was quite a thing. Argentina was unusually difficult and had been so for a long time. It did not become difficult in 2001. And the Argentines went through a cycle repeatedly of getting themselves in such trouble that they had to go to the IMF and the US. They had to get some financial help, promise to reform, do a few things, and they would cut spending somewhat and so on. And then things would start again. And pretty soon they'd be back in the soup all over again. By 2001, they'd done that many times. And by 2001, as I was coming to the fund, their present to me was being very much in the soup. There was actually an IMF loan underway when I got there, which did not do much, and so I'll skip it over. But beyond that, the problem was in Argentina that the Argentines themselves would not face up to what they'd done. The finance minister, the economy minister for Argentina, the IMF fund meetings in 2001 delayed a bit because of the 9/11 crisis and held in Ottawa. The finance and the economy minister went around with a sheet of paper showing, he said, and told his colleagues, the other governors of the IMF, that here shows our numbers, we really can do this. The IMF was saying we can't do it because the numbers are all wrong. And basically, finally, a couple of IMF staff sat down, and one night we worked out that not only were the numbers wrong, but the numbers were inconsistent among themselves. We invited the economy minister to come to Washington and said, okay, we're going to talk, but step one is going to be you are going to go through and show us consistent numbers. Step two will then be we'll talk about what it needs doing. And we gave him a small room. He's actually a room of research assistant. And the economy minister, normally dressed as gentlemen who are in those positions in Latin America normally are, with black suit and tie and all the rest of it, was there with his shirt and his tie off, working a hand calculator, working the numbers. And he disappeared at 9 o'clock that night because he discovered that we were right. His numbers were wrong. And he flew back to Argentina. And that was within about 2 days of when the Argentines finally said they had to do something. But what then happened, and I'm making a very long story very short, was that over the next month and a half, I think, Argentina had 5 different presidents. Nobody could even hold the office. The place had fallen apart that fast. It was very difficult to handle. Finally, the American government decided that lending had to go ahead, I think on political grounds, to keep the situation under control. But as you know, Argentina at the moment is as yet another reform program, which has some aspects of a more serious one than some of the ones we saw earlier, but others were not. John was regarded as a more or less good guy by the Argentines, and I was regarded as a bad guy. And I think we actually did a service to some extent to the U.S. by serving the bad guy function, which got A, more than could be, and B, left them at the position where they were pleading with the U.S. for help against that evil organization. There was even a cover on the Argentine equivalent of the U.S. Time magazine of 3 people in military garb, soldiers in their arms, one of whom was then president, one was Colin Powell, one was me, and one was, who was the third, with 3 of us, the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, yes, and so on. And we were the 3 soldiers who were attacking Argentina. No, Kenneth was gone before I came. No, it was not the third person, it was me. I was the fun one. No, not by the horse, it was my picture on the cover.
Okay.
Okay. Anyway, sovereign debt, just quickly. Sovereign debt is a problem because countries, while they can go bankrupt, you can't exactly seize their assets. You can't take them to court and have them restructured in quite the same way. And there are problems because there used to be not a problem because there were just governments that led to developing countries. That changed. And now there's private debt, there's official debt, and so on. An interesting part of it was, I think it was Sebastian mentioned when when de Larosière brought in the bankers. He could bring in 13 bankers who held 90% of the outstanding emerging market debt in 1982. There were maybe 10% who held a much smaller percentage of the debt. But you could basically call in the bankers and say, we're not going to lend to them unless you do. And if we don't lend, they're not going to pay you. And so basically, why don't we get together? And they could make the system work. It got more and more difficult as there were more and more creditors from more and more places, but eventually, with a still relatively large amount of sovereign debt, and with the Paris Club, which coordinated the sovereign part of it, or among the creditor side, it was possible to get agreements, often, however, with delays. I think it was 1996 when the G20 called for some kind of better mechanism first. But by the Argentine crisis, it was worse. And John and I both worked on that. And as John Lipsky already said, John's collective action clauses won in the sense that that's what's happened, and that has made a difference. But 2 things. First of all, collective action clauses do not cover all debtors, unfortunately, because not all debtors are not all obligations are bonds and things like that. But the second one, and the one that's important and is going to be a problem for the international system for a few years to come at least, and I hope not even that long, is of course the Chinese have become big lenders. They've refused to join the Paris Club with other sovereign lenders, and they're refusing to reduce the face value of their debt. They will, as they say, let the countries delay payment, but when they delay payment, the amount they are required or demanded to be paid by the Chinese, the interest rate is even higher than it would be if they went and loaned. And so basically, things have been very held up. We've seen Zambia, which waited more than poor little country, waited more than 3 years for a rescheduling. We've seen Sri Lanka, which was held up and still does not have it sorted out. And the Chinese at the moment, as they've emerged as an important creditor, have become another major problem in the entire sovereign debt restructuring issue. So I think that while John made an enormous contribution and got that one going, I do not think that is by any sense the end of the story. Now, if I had time, I would go into the US dollar and exchange rates, but I think I'm going to get called by our chairman pretty quickly, and I know there are things that we want to do after this as well. So I'm just going to end by saying it's really hard to get your head around the depth and scope of responsibilities that the person in charge of American international financial interactions with the rest of the world has. It really is. It's an amazing job, and John, I don't know how you did it, and I congratulate you then. But I'm also going to end with a story because we had one, and I think you told it before too, so I'm not telling any secrets. But John and I, of course, were at some degree of disagreement, to say the least, over how you handled the sovereign debt issue. And every year, as you know, there's a White House press correspondence dinner. And one year I was invited, and I agreed to go. And everybody's invited by a journalist. And I was invited by a journalist I knew and said, come, that looked fine. Got there, and who's sitting next to me at the table but John Taylor. And he's sitting next to me, and the journalist that invited him was down a seat or two. And well, as it happened, John and I had a golf date the next morning. And so we began discussing what time and the arrangement, and the looks on the faces of these two journalists as they were waiting for us to have an argument right in front of them was really worth the trouble of the entire event. It was quite a moment because we were friends on the side. Everybody said that John doesn't hold things over. And so we basically could meet socially, no problem, but we did disagree on that one. And that's another testimony to John as not only a superb economist, but also a wonderful human being. Thanks, John.
Okay. So last but not least, we have Peter Fisher.
Thank you. Thank you, John and Mike, especially for the honor of holding up the rear and having the opportunity to echo so many themes struck by so many others today. Let me say that when I think of the meaning of John Taylor's government service, particularly at the Treasury, of course, what comes first to mind is what a wonderful colleague and friend and role model John was. But even more, I'm struck by John's particular corner solution to the dilemma of the serious public servant. When I arrived as John's domestic counterpart, I thought I knew what was wrong with Washington. I thought a handful of obstinate ideologues, refusing to listen to others, were throwing sand in the gears of government and preventing all progress. I quickly learned that I was precisely mistaken. I was correct that there were only a few people in Washington who will tell you what they believe, will tell you they're going to fight like hell for what they believe, and then they do. They stick to their principles. Most just get up in the morning and stick a finger in the air to see which way the wind is blowing. They are almost impossible to deal with because they follow the never-ending path of least resistance. Progress depends entirely on those like John, who will tell you what they believe, explain their principles, and will stick to them, making it possible to appeal to principle to find common ground in pursuit of a common good. Most of what you do when you sit in an office of an undersecretary, the one thing that's consistent day after day after day and hour after hour, is not the type of problem you face. You've all heard all the many different issues John faced. It's that you face the dilemma of the serious senior public servant. It is this: how much of your limited time and discretion should you commit unflinchingly to a few important principles, both to resist bad ideas and to do the most you can to make at least your corner of the world a better place, at the risk of being branded as having a tin ear for politics, or as an obstinate ideologue, or even worse? And in the alternative, how much of your time do you spend bending to the political winds of the day, deferring to others, accepting that our federal government has many competing objectives, and accommodate your principles to other priorities and personalities, to avoid standing out as one of the obstinate few, but at the risk of doing less than you might to make the world a better place? Even if, John, you did not adopt a pure corner solution, deep down, I don't think you even recognize that as a dilemma. And in defending unflinchingly your principles, you made the world a better place. Now, many wonderful examples have been mentioned. I'm just going to touch on my favorites. I recall with admiration John applying his best efforts to use Argentina as an opportunity to lean against, providing liquidity to the insolvent and lending into arrears. I also think of his vigorous support, not mentioned today as I recall, for making grants, not loans, to the poorest nations, nudging us in this more sensible direction. In each case, John was steadfast in his support of one of my favorite principles. It's not a good idea to lend money to people who cannot pay you back. It's not good for them, and it's not good for you either. In promoting the use of collective action clauses, as Barry explained, against the conventional wisdom, John promoted an important corollary. Nations should not borrow money they may not be able to repay without a plan, any plan, to avoid the problems of holdouts and restructuring. And for the last decade, all newly issued emerging market sovereign debt, almost all of it, has included some form of collective action clauses. So even if John had not made his many contributions to all the topics you've touched on today, his service at the Treasury would have struck a blow for financial thoughtfulness and as an example of unflinching adherence to core principles. George Bernard Shaw explained that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world, the unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself, therefore all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Now, I think Shaw overstates his case slightly. Being unreasonable or appearing to be unreasonable may be a necessary but cannot be a sufficient condition to be an agent of progress. Being an unreasonable reactionary and creating chaos in pursuit of dubious principles are no guarantee of social or economic advance, as we may now be observing. History will judge whether the unreasonable man is unreasonable in pursuit of great reason and a greater good or not. We can now judge John as successful. John effectively helped to bend the course of international financial policy in more sensible directions. He helped make his corner of the world a better place, and at some cost. John, I'm grateful for your example and what you accomplished. I hope you can forgive those who lack the fortitude to risk the slings and arrows that will come if they adopt your resolute solution to the dilemma of the serious public servant. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the whole panel. We have a few minutes, according to the program, for questions or comments. So don't be shy. Anyone? Okay, if there are 3 more seconds. It's going to be like an auctioneer here. Anyone? 1? Oh, over there. Okay. Over there at the very end. State your name so that for the
I'm Shirley, and I'm actually one of Professor Taylor's students, so this is really inspiring to see. And I guess something that I'm curious that we've briefly touched on is what kind of qualities are necessary for an academic working in government, as well as the different challenges. And I'm kind of curious to hear more about the challenges aspect of that and how you've either witnessed other academics or Professor Taylor in navigating those challenges and I guess standing against the political winds. Yeah.
Okay, let me see if there are other questions. We'll collect if there are others, and then we'll have the panel answer that question. Qualities to become a successful, influential civil servant. Yes. Remember to state your name.
Hi, Pamela Hawley. Our family is very involved in CEPR. I wanted to know, with all of these fascinating stories about the government and how, economic policy and all these kind of stories on the ground, if you have recommendations on the best books, white papers, whatever we can learn from this way, seeing that kind of practical application.
Well, Global Financial Warriors, for one. John, I'm going to get a cut from the new royalties you'll get, huh? Any others? Yes, over here. Hi. Here. Hold on. So we need this for the minutes of the meeting. Yes.
Hi.
Name again?
My name's Rutvij. I am a sophomore here at Stanford, and I was just wondering, in terms of understanding what John's contribution was in helping track down, terrorist financing. At least what was explained was that he was basically talking with other countries and getting them to kind of come together to be able to track what's going on. But wouldn't that be, I guess, more of a game of diplomacy rather than financial policy? So how exactly do the two intersect?
Okay, great question. Okay, one more, if we have one more. Otherwise, we'll go back to the panel, and I think that John is going to say a few words later. So over there, yes, one more.
Thank you, Chris Meisner. I think Ann Krueger mentioned she wanted to talk about the debt and the dollar and ran out of time, and I wondered if she cared to give us the short version of those comments since we have a few extra minutes. I'm curious. Thank you.
Okay. So one interesting thing that I tell my students, that, and I think I'm right, is that dollar policy is a Treasury decision. It's not with the Fed. In many countries, it's the central bank, and I think that the dollar policy is with the Treasury. So that's a very interesting question. So let's go back to the panel, and let's start maybe with, okay, Condi.
All right. I'll talk about the two of these. One is about the qualities that it takes. And I actually think when you go in as an academic, the tendency of academics is to know something in depth very, very well. And when you're in government, actually, it's very rare that a policy dilemma will come exactly in your area of expertise. And it gets to be very hard then when you're accustomed to knowing something in depth. Remember that at the moment that you finish your dissertation, you know more about that little thing than anybody else in the world. And so you have to be able to be someone who can take your expertise, ask important questions of people who have other expertise, learn how to ask the second and third order question, and then come to some kind of solution. So I think breaking out of your narrowness as an academic is hard. The second thing that's hard is, as academics, we have all year to get something done. A friend of mine often says, oh, it's a quarter to May, I guess I'd better get started. Well, in government, you very often have to try to solve a problem very quickly. You don't have perfect information. You can't keep searching for information. And so you have to be somebody who's comfortable with getting to that point. So I think those are a couple of qualities. And then one that was mentioned by Peter, I think it was, you do have to have a kind of North Star. I've often been asked, what do you do if something is against your values or against your principles? Then you don't do it. But the truth is, you're almost always trying to weigh competing values and competing principles. And that's why I think it's actually harder than it looks. It's not, oh, that's against my principles. It's I have these competing principles. For instance, with The Economist, when we would talk about the 311 sanctions that Ann talked about, which really are kind of the nuclear weapon of financial sanctions. On the one hand, you don't want to undermine the confidence in the United States and in the dollar, and the United States as a place for investment. On the other hand, what other strategy are you going to use against the Russians when they invade Ukraine, for instance? So I think it's usually competing values, not one set of values or another. And just to the interesting question about diplomacy and why the terrorist financing fell to Treasury, not to state. Well, state would play its role, of course, but understanding how financial flows really worked, particularly through the shadow banking system that had arisen, was really an economist kind of question. But of course, when it comes to the diplomacy, you have to work very closely between state and Treasury to get that done.
Thank you, Condi. John, you had a very long, successful career in the private sector, investment banking. Maybe you can tell us the difference between the skills required for that and public service and being in government?
That's a good question. I think I could talk specifically about coming to the fund.
Okay, sure.
And let me begin by taking something that Condi said about having a North Star. When you're dealing in a multilateral context, it's even harder to get definitive answers. It's always a compromise, and you've just got to be able to take the long view, to keep pushing, don't get discouraged, keep at it. What I did find, surprisingly, when I came from investment banking to the IMF, was investment bankers as a senior, as a manager in investment banking, you worried about the people and developing the people and making sure you had the right people in the right place to do the right job. And what I found when I came to the fund is that the senior people worried more about whether the answer was right. And so it tended to lead to everybody checking and checking. And I thought, no, you need to spend much more time making sure you have the right people and the right job, rather than marking their test. And we actually did a whole bunch of things at the fund to try to make it much more that way.
Thank you, John. Anne, about any of the questions that were raised?
Well, I understood also the question about the transition from or to academia, and I would respond at least partially differently from John. First off, there are some people who do go into government or one of the international organizations. They learn something there, often very things important that are not necessarily academic, and then transition not necessarily to the very top universities, but quite a few of them do go in teaching in liberal arts colleges and places like that and become very good academics. Some of them have an area in which they know enough so they publish quite satisfactorily from the viewpoint of whatever the standards at the university are. And so some people do it the other way. They go into academia and after a while move over. And at least it has been the case also that the American government has wanted, or many people in the government have wanted to hire academics for particular consulting purposes, which gives some exposure and gives you some knowledge and so on. At least for me, that was an important learning route. I was doing a lot of work on developing countries. In fact, when I went to the fund, had you asked me the countries in which I knew most about, it was Argentina and Turkey and Brazil, which were 3 of our 5 most important, would all have been ones that I had been working in quite recently and had a fair background in, not because I'd worked in government, but because I'd worked in other things. There are other ways too, but I think the point Peter and Condi both made is important, and that is there has to be some flexibility in the sense of adapting to the others around you and what the regulations and the constraints really are. And I think that's important. No matter where you come from, when you get into government, the politics are there, and you can't say, I'm going to ignore it. You can say, how do I use it? It's the best you can do, and you can hope.
Thank you, Anne. Peter?
Yes, I'll just briefly echo on this question of how to operate in government, and I think Condi touched, I just want to echo it. And something's ringing in my ear that the late Bob Glauber taught me before I became undersecretary, and it looked like we were headed into a recession, and I was going to be sworn in as undersecretary, and I went and asked Bob, he was teaching at Harvard at the time, for advice about how to do my job as undersecretary for domestic finance. And he said, Peter, you need to know you won't have time to read anything. And it's more like performance art. People will come into your office with a problem. You have to diagnose it and suggest a course of action on the spot. You don't get the chance to go read the briefing memos after the fact. And that's an extreme version, I think, of what Condi's saying, is you can't wait around. You don't get a lot of time. You have to, and you better take whatever tools you have and then apply them. So that's a little piece of advice.
Thank you so much to the panel, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.